William Shakespeare is widely regarded as one of the greatest writers of the English literary tradition. His extensive body of work includes 154 sonnets, 39 plays, and 2 narrative poems, spanning tragedy, comedy, and historical genres. His masterpieces, such as Hamlet, Romeo and Juliet, and A Midsummer Night's Dream, have profoundly influenced literature, theatre, and the English language. In fact, he introduced over 1,700 new words to the language. His profound insights into human nature and emotion, combined with his innovative use of language and verse, ensure that his works are celebrated, studied, and performed around the world more than 4 centuries after his death. Hello and welcome to the channel. If you're new here and it's your first time, it's great to meet you. And if you're coming back, it's good to see you again. As always, the best way to support the channel is by enjoying the content. Liking and subscribing is a level up from that, and those who wish to go beyond may refer to the description. You'll find where you need to go. Now, with that being said, let us begin. Take a deep breath and relax, and we can begin our biography of William Shakespeare. Born in Stratford-upon-Avon, that being the town of Stratford upon the Avon River, William Shakespeare was baptized on April 26, 1564. His precise birth date is unknown, but it is traditionally observed on St. George's Day, that's April 23rd, and coincidentally that is the same date that he passed away later in 1616. He was the 3rd child and eldest surviving son of a family of 8, which was a pretty normal size of a family at that time. Born to John Shakespeare, an alderman and successful glove maker from Snitterfield. His mother was Mary Arden, a member of a wealthy landowning family. So you could say that he was well and truly middle class. It is widely believed that Shakespeare was educated at the King's New School in Stratford, a free school that was established in 1553 and situated about a quarter mile from his home. Despite the variability in the quality of grammar schools during the Elizabethan era, their curricula were fairly consistent, if you could find one. Students received a rigorous education centered around Latin texts as standardized by a royal decree. At the age of 18, Shakespeare married a woman by the name of Anne Hathaway, who was 26 at the time. The marriage license was issued by the Diocese of Worcester's Constitutory Court on November the 27th, 1582. The following day, the bonds were posted by 2 of Hathaway's neighbors to ensure there were no legal barriers to their marriage. The haste of the wedding is suggested by the Chancellor's decision to read the banns once rather than the usual 3 times. 6 months after the wedding, their daughter Susanna was baptized on May 26, 1583. Twins Hamlet and Judith followed, baptized on the 2nd of February, 1585. However, poor little Hamlet died at the age of 11, with his burial noted on August 11th, 1596. Pretty common back in those days to have a lot of children and not feel too bad about it. Many of them simply wouldn't make it through. Just a fact of life, a very unfortunate one, but a fact nonetheless. Post the birth of his twins, Shakespeare's life becomes a little less documented, until he emerges on the London theatre scene in 1592. The period between 1585 and 1592 is often referred to as Shakespeare's lost years. Various anecdotal stories do exist about this time. For example, Nicholas Rowe, who was Shakespeare's first biographer, shared a local legend from Stratford that Shakespeare fled to London to avoid prosecution for poaching deer from the estate of Squire Thomas Lucy, whom he later ridiculed in a satirical ballad. Another 18th century story describes Shakespeare starting his theatrical career by managing horses for the theatre patrons in London. John Aubrey suggested that Shakespeare had been a country schoolmaster. Some 20th century scholars speculated he worked for Alexandra Houghton of Lancashire. He was a Catholic landowner who mentioned a one William Shakespeare in his will, which was a common name in Lancashire at the time. Now, the only record of Shakespeare during this period is his appearance on what is called a complaints bill from a Queen's Bench court case dated Michaelmas, term 1588, and October 9th, 1589. And these years, of course, are just filled with stories largely based on hearsay. Illustrates the mystery surrounding his early adult life. But I suppose that's not really what he's remembered for. Well, his exact beginning as a writer is also unclear, but it seems by 1592, several of his plays were known to be staged in London. This attention led to a critical remark from playwright Robert Greene in his works Groat's Worth of Wit, where Greene mocks Shakespeare as an upstart crow, suggesting he was overreaching by comparing himself to university-educated writers such as Thomas Nash and Christopher Marlowe, known at the time as the University Wits. Greene's use of shake scene in his critique clearly points to Shakespeare, making this one of the earliest mentions of Shakespeare's work in the theatre. Thus his career likely started sometime between the mid-1580s and just before Greene's public rebuke. Well, from 1594 onwards, William exclusively wrote for the Lord Chamberlain's Men, a theatre company he partly owned, and which became London's premier group. After the death of Queen Elizabeth in 1603, they received a royal patent from King James I, and were renamed the King's Men. The year of 1599 was notable for Shakespeare. He and his partners built the Globe Theatre on the Thames South Bank, that's the main river that goes through London, and took over the Blackfriars Indoor Theatre in 1608. His financial successes from these ventures allowed him to purchase New Place, which at the time was Stratford's second largest house, in 1597, and invest in local tithes in 1605. Shakespeare's works started appearing in quarto editions from 1594, with his name boosting sales by 1598. He continued acting in his and others' plays beyond his writing success. Notably, the 1616 edition of Ben Jonson's works list him as an actor in several plays, indicating he maintained his acting roles alongside writing. However, evidence like his absence from the 1605 Volpone cast suggests a gradual end to his acting career. Yet, he is listed in the first folio of 1623 as a principal actor in many plays, some staged after Volpone. Traditions and some speculative sources say he played roles like the ghost of Hamlet's father, and parts in As You Like It and Henry V. Shakespeare balanced his life between London and Stratford throughout his career. He lived on and off in various parts of London, from St. Helens, Bishopgate in 1596, moving to Southwark by 1599, and then to an area quite nearby to St. Paul's Cathedral in 1604, where he rented from Christopher Montjoy, a rather prolific wig maker. Critics often agree that Shakespeare collaborated with other playwrights throughout his career, particularly in the early formative stages and in the late creative stages. His earliest works include Richard III and the three parts of Henry VI, crafted during the early 1590s amidst a trend for historical drama. While the exact dates of Shakespeare's plays are challenging to pinpoint, it is believed that Titus Andronicus, the Comedy of Errors, the Taming of the Shrew, and the Two Gentlemen of Verona may also be from his early period. These initial historical plays, drawing heavily on Raphael Holinshed's 1587 Chronicles of England, Scotland, and Ireland, seem to support the legitimacy of the Tudor dynasty by showing the chaos of weak or corrupt leaders. Shakespeare's style in these early works shows the influence of other dramatists like Thomas Kyd and Christopher Marlowe, as well as the conventions of medieval drama and the works of Seneca. His play, The Comedy of Errors, was influenced by classical models, but no clear source has been identified for the Taming of the Shrew, at least not as of yet. This play possibly linked to a separate play of the same name, and may be derived from a folk tale, along with the Two Gentlemen of Verona, which hints at endorsing several unfortunate aspects, such as the R word. It's posed a few challenges for modern critics, directors, and audience due to its narratives on taming a woman's independent spirit. Well, in the mid-1590s, Shakespeare's early comedies, known for their tight double plots and precise sequences, evolved into the romantic atmosphere of his acclaimed works, like A Midsummer Night's Dream, a blend of romance, magic, and humor. His next comedy, The Merchant of Venice, presents the vengeful Jewish moneylender Shylock, reflecting the era's prevalent views, but potentially appearing a little derogatory today. Well, I suppose offense is going to depend on who's taking it. This was followed by the wit of Much Ado About Nothing, the rural charm of As You Like It, and the festive spirit of the Twelfth Night. After the poetic Richard II, Shakespeare introduced prose comedy into the histories of the later 1590s with Henry IV, Part 1 and 2, followed by Henry V. Here the character of Falstaff emerges as a friend to Prince Hal, showcasing a blend of comedic and rather serious tones, paired with the narrative depth of Shakespeare's more mature works. This period includes the tragedies, Romeo and Juliet, a portrayal of passionate adolescence and love leading to death, and of course Julius Caesar, which introduced a new form of drama, as described by modern James Shapiro, where various strands of politics, character, inwardness, contemporary events, and even Shakespeare's own reflections on the act of writing began to infuse each other. In the early 17th century, Shakespeare penned the problem plays, namely Measure for Measure, Troilus and Cressida, and All's Well That Ends Well, alongside several of his best-known tragedies. Critics often view these tragedies as the pinnacle of his art. The character Hamlet, known for the soliloquy, "To be or not to be, that is the question," is one of Shakespeare's most analyzed and, of course, well known. In contrast to Hamlet's introspective nature, characters like Othello and Lear seem to act impulsively, which leads to their downfall. These tragedies often focus on such fatal errors or flaws, disrupting order and leading to the demise of the hero and those around him. In Othello, for example, the jealousy stirred by Lago leads to the tragic killing of Othello's innocent wife, Desdemona. In King Lear, titular character's design to relinquish his power sets off a chain of events leading to the murder of his own daughter, Cordelia, and of course the blinding of the Earl of Gloucester, described by critic Frank Kermode as offering neither the characters nor the abundance any relief from its cruelty. In Macbeth, ambition drives the titular character and his wife to murder the rightful king and usurp his throne, leading to their eventual destruction. This play integrates a supernatural element into its framework. His final major tragedies, Antony and Cleopatra and Coriolanus, showcase some of Shakespeare's finest poetry, and according to T.S. Eliot, are among his most successful tragedies. T.S. Eliot also commented that, and I quote, "Shakespeare acquired more essential history from Plutarch than most men could from the whole British Museum." In this last phase, Shakespeare turned to romance or tragicomedy, a mix of tragedy and comedy, finishing plays like Cymbeline, The Winter's Tale, and The Tempest, as well as the collaborative work Pericles, Prince of Tyre. These plays, less grim than the earlier tragedies, end with reconciliation and forgiveness for potentially tragic mistakes. Some critics view this change as evidence of a more peaceful outlook in Shakespeare's final years, though it may simply reflect theatrical trends. He also worked with John Fletcher on two more plays, Henry VIII and The Two Noble Kinsmen. These collaborations and his final plays suggest a culmination of Shakespeare's evolving artistry, ending with a focus on redemption and reconciliation in his later works. In the late 19th century, Edward Dowden reclassified 4 of Shakespeare's later comedies as romances due to their unique blend of comedic and tragic elements, though many scholars today refer to them as what is called tragicomedies, and the term has been widely adopted, not just for Shakespearean works. Shakespeare's early plays were performed by various troupes, as indicated by the 1594 quarto of Titus Andronicus, which lists 3 different companies. Following the plagues of 1592 to 93, his plays were primarily performed by his own troupe, probably because the other troops were all dead. I'm just speculating. Well, first they were performed at the Theatre, creative name, I know, and then at the Curtain in Shoreditch, which is north of the Thames. The public's enthusiasm for Shakespeare's characters, like Falstaff and Hal, made the plays extremely popular. A dispute with their landlord, actually, led the company to dismantle the theatre. That was the name of the venue, not the venue itself, and reuse its timbers to construct the famous Globe Theatre on the south banks of the Thames at Southwark in 1599. The Globe, which opened in the autumn of that year, was a rather innovative playhouse, built by and for actors, where many of Shakespeare's most celebrated plays, including Hamlet, Othello, and King Lear, were performed. The renaming of the Lord Chamberlain's men to the King's men in 1603 marked the beginning of a close relationship with King James I. Court records from 1604 to 05 show that the King's men performed several of Shakespeare's plays, including 2 renditions of The Merchant of Venice. Post-1608, the troupe split their performances between the Globe in the summer and the indoor Blackfriars Theatre in the winter. The more elaborate staging possible at the Blackfriars, combined with the Jacobean trend for lavishly staged masks, allowed Shakespeare to introduce more sophisticated stage effects. In Cymbeline, for instance, Jupiter descends amidst thunder and lightning, marking a shift in theatrical presentation. Key actors in Shakespeare's company included Richard Burbage, who originated roles such as Richard III, Othello, Hamlet, and King Lear. William Kempe, known for his comedic roles like Peter in Romeo and Juliet, and Dogberry in Much Ado About Nothing. And later, Robert Armin, who took over from Kemp around 1600 to play parts like Touchstone in As You Like It, and the Fool in King Lear. In 613, an eyewitness account by Sir Henry Wotton describes a performance of Henry VIII with, and I quote, many extraordinary circumstances of pomp and ceremony. Sounds like my kind of show. On the 29th of June in that same year, 1613, apparently a cannon had misfired and set the attached roof of the Globe on fire. Of course, the Globe's roof was a thatched one, which is notoriously inflammable. Well, the entire theatre ended up burning down. But they did reconstruct it, and today it still stands on the banks of the Thames. You can go visit it. It kind of sticks out among all the modern buildings in London, a testament to the old architecture, although I'm sure they won't be firing any cannons in or at the building anytime soon. Well, in 1623, John Hemmings and Henry Condell, fellow actors from the King's Men and close friends of Shakespeare, compiled and published the First Folio, which was a comprehensive collection of Shakespeare's plays. This edition is significant because it includes 36 plays, 18 of which that had not previously been published. The plays that had appeared before this folio were only available as quartos, which were of course notoriously inexpensive and often inaccurately printed. The First Folio criticizes these earlier versions as stolen and surreptitious copies. Alfred Pollard, referring to some of these early quartos as bad quartos due to their erroneous and often distorted texts, possibly reconstructed from the actor's memories or audience notes. Significant textual variations are found among the surviving versions of the plays, attributable to a mix of printing mistakes, notes from actors or the audience, and even potential revisions by Shakespeare himself. Notably, plays like Hamlet, Troilus and Cressida and Othello might have been revised by Shakespeare between their quarto and folio editions. In the case of King Lear, the text of the 1608 quarto and the 1623 folio are so different that they are often published separately to avoid any confusion, and you can see this in the Oxford Shakespeare edition. Well, during 1593 and 94, a plague led to the closure of theatres, prompting Shakespeare to shift his focus, and while he was trying to figure out what to do, he decided on Raid Shadow Legends. No, I'm just kidding. I had to put a raid joke in there. He switched his focus to poetry, rather. He published 2 narrative poems, Venus and Adonis, and the R-word of Lucrece. You know, I can't say that word on YouTube. They don't like it. Dedicating them to Henry Wriothesley, the Earl of Southampton. Venus and Adonis depicts the goddess Venus's unrequited love for the beautiful youth Adonis, while the R-word of Lucrece tells the tragic story of the title character, who is R-worded by the lustful Tarquin. Both poems, drawing from Ovid's Metamorphoses, explore the themes of lust and its moral consequences, and become quite popular during Shakespeare's lifetime. A Lover's Complaint, another narrative poem about a seduced young woman, and The Phoenix and the Turtle, an allegory about the death of a mythical phoenix and his love a turtle dove, were also attributed to Shakespeare. In 1599, 2 of his sonnets, 138 and 144, were published without his permission in a work titled The Passionate Pilgrim. The Sonnets of Shakespeare, a collection of 154 poems, were published in 1609, marking his last non-dramatic work to appear in print. These sonnets, written throughout his career for a private audience, reflect deep themes such as love, passion, beauty, mortality, and time. Francis Meres mentioned Shakespeare's Sugred sonnets in 1598, suggesting they were shared privately among friends before their official publication. The sequence of the sonnets in the published version doesn't appear to follow Shakespeare's original order, and seems to be divided into 2 contrasting series, one about a dark-complexioned woman, creatively titled The Dark Lady, and another about a fair young man, titled The Fair Youth. This division has led to much speculation about the identities of these individuals, and whether they are real or fictional, or if the narrative voice is actually Shakespeare himself. Wordsworth famously said that Shakespeare unlocked his heart with these sonnets. The 1609 edition of the Sonnets publication was dedicated to a Mr. W. H., described as the only begetter of the poems. The identity of this Mr. W.H., whether he is the mysterious patron or perhaps an orchestrator in getting the sonnets published, remains unknown. This dedication could have been penned by Shakespeare or perhaps the publisher, Thomas Thorpe, whose initials appear on the dedication page. The sonnets are lauded for their exploration of love, desire, procreation, and themes of mortality. Well, at the outset of his career, the early plays, including The Two Gentlemen of Verona and Titus Andronicus, adhered to the more conventional styles and rigid structures of the day, characterized by stylized language and extended metaphors. Critics have pointed out that these grandiose speeches sometimes slowed the action, with verse that could appear overwrought or perhaps even stilted. Shakespeare, however, quickly began to modify these classical forms and suit his own dramatic purposes, certainly taking the basics and tweaking them and changing them to his own style. An early indication of this evolving process is evident in Richard III's opening soliloquy, which recalls the medieval drama's vice, but also anticipates the deeper self-reflection seen in his later plays. His approach didn't shift overnight, however. Rather, Shakespeare blended tradition and innovative styles throughout the course of his career, with Romeo and Juliet and Richard II demonstrating a particularly effective mix of these techniques. And also, go and watch my video on Richard II. It was, if I do say so myself, a banger. Well, by the mid-1590s, including works like A Midsummer Night's Dream, his poetry had become quite a bit more natural, adjusting metaphors and imagery more closely to the narrative's requirements. Shakespeare's preferred verse form was blank verse, written in unrhymed iambic pentameter. This structure typically meant that each line was made up of 10 syllables, with an emphasis on every second syllable. The blank verse in his early plays, while quite nice to read, was often a little monotonous, with lines frequently pausing at their end. Over time, Shakespeare began to break this pattern, introducing more rhythmical variety and depth. This evolution is particularly evident in Julius Caesar and Hamlet, where he disrupts the flow to mirror the character's emotional turmoil. For instance, in Hamlet, Shakespeare writes, and I'll read a little bit from it now, "Sir, in my heart there was a kind of fighting that would not let me sleep. Methought I lay worse than the mutinies in the bilboes. Rashly, and praised be rashness for it, let us know. Our indiscretion sometimes serves us well." As he moved into the late tragedies, his style grew even more varied and intense, as seen in Macbeth, where the language shifts rapidly among metaphors and similes, demanding more from the listener to piece together the full and deeper meaning. His later works, including the romances, feature abrupt plot shifts and complex sentence structures, creating a sense of spontaneity and fluidity. Shakespeare was not only a poetic genius, but he also had a pragmatic sense of theatre. He often adapted stories from classical sources such as Plutarch's Lives and Holinshed's Chronicles, reshaping each narrative to broaden its appeal and present multiple perspectives. His skill in plot design meant that his plays could endure substantial adaptation or translation, without losing their intrinsic drama. I'm sure we've all seen the adaptation of Romeo and Juliet. You know, the one you probably watched in high school with Leonardo DiCaprio, and I forgot the other person that was in it. Wasn't Kate Winslet, wasn't it? Maybe she was in Titanic, I'm not sure. But, yes, it was adapted for modern times, but the story was still there. It was the same story with a different coat of paint, and Shakespeare's stories are very easy to do this with. Well, in his later years, particularly in his romance works, he revisited the more formalized styles of his earlier works, enhancing the theatrical illusion. Throughout his career, he developed characters with more nuanced motivations and distinct speech patterns, while maintaining elements of his earlier style in subsequent plays. Nicholas Rowe was the first biographer to note the tradition, which Samuel Johnson later echoed, that Shakespeare retired to Stratford a few years before his death. In 1608, he was still active as an actor in London. Cuthbert Burbage mentioned that after acquiring the lease of the Blackfriars Theatre from Henry Evans in 1608, the King's Men, which included Hemmings, Condell, Shakespeare, etc., were stationed there as players. Of course, the bubonic plague's presence in London throughout 1609 and repeated closures of public playhouses, over 60 months closed between May 1603 and February 1610 due to the plague, meant that actors often lacked work. I suppose some things never change. Rare was complete retirement at this time. Shakespeare continued his visits to London in 1611 to 1614. In 1612, during the Bellot versus Montjoy case, he testified about the marriage settlement of Montjoy's daughter, Mary. In March 1613, he purchased a gatehouse in the former Blackfriars Priory, and from November 1614 he spent several weeks in London with his son-in-law, John Hall. After 1610, his writings began to slow down, and we don't have any works, at least ones we've discovered, that are attributed to him post-1613. His final 3 plays were collaborations, likely with John Fletcher, who succeeded him as the King's Men's House playwright. Thus Shakespeare retired in 1613, before the Globe Theatre burned down during that performance of Henry VIII on the 29th of June. Shakespeare then passed away on the 23rd of April 1616, at the age of 52, which is pretty young, for someone with money at least. Back in those days, if you were poor dying at 52, well, that was normal. But usually, the better off you were, the better living standard you would have, cleaner home. Well, unfortunately, Shakespeare didn't live that long. But as they say, the candle that burns twice as bright only burns for half the time. Well, he died shortly after drafting his will, which began by declaring him, ironically, in perfect health. No contemporary source that we have clarifies his death's cause or nature. About 50 years later, John Ward, the vicar of Stratford, wrote in his notes, "Shakespeare, Drayton, and Ben Jonson had a merry meeting, and, it seems, drank too hard, for Shakespeare died of a fever he contracted there." And this was a believable scenario. since Shakespeare was indeed quite acquainted with both Jonson and Drayton. Tributes from other writers reference his relatively abrupt demise, such as, "We wondered, Shakespeare, that thou went'st so soon from the world's stage to the grave's tiring room." He left behind his wife and 2 daughters. Susanna married the physician John Hall in 1607, and Judith wed Thomas Quinney, a vintner, 2 months before Shakespeare's death. On the 25th of March, 1616, Shakespeare signed his last will and testament. Thomas Quinney, his new son-in-law, was found guilty of fathering an illegitimate son by Margaret Wheeler, who died in childbirth. Thus the court ordered Quinney to do public penance, bringing embarrassment to the Shakespeare family. His substantial estate was left primarily to the eldest daughter, Susanna, with the condition that it be passed intact to the first son of her body. The Quinney's 3 children all died without marrying. The Hall's only child, Elizabeth, married twice, but died without children in 1670. And with that, Shakespeare's direct lineage was ended. His will makes scant mention of his wife, Anne, likely already entitled to 1/3 of his estate. However, he notably bequeathed her "my second best bed," a legacy that has sparked quite a bit of speculation. Some scholars interpret the bequest as an insult, while others believe that the second best bed had significant matrimonial value. Well, Shakespeare was interred in the chancel of the Holy Trinity Church 2 days after his death. His grave's stone slab is inscribed with a curse moving his remains, which was carefully heeded during the church's 2008 restoration. And it goes like this: "Good friend, for Jesus' sake forbear to dig the dust enclosed here. Blessed be the man that spares these stones, and cursed be he that moves my bones." Prior to 1623, a memorial monument was erected on the north wall of the church, featuring a half-effigy of Shakespeare writing. The plaque compares him to Nestor, Socrates, and Virgil. Numerous statues and memorials worldwide commemorate Shakespeare, including funeral monuments in Southwark Cathedral and the Poets' Corner in Westminster Abbey. So we all know that Shakespeare's work has profoundly influenced later theatre and literature. It's left an impact on the dramatic potential of character development, plot construction, language, and just the whole genre. For instance, before Romeo and Juliet, romance was not considered a suitable subject for tragedy, at least not in the Western tradition. Look back on Chinese plays, and it's pretty much all tragedies. Soliloquies, once primarily used to convey information, were transformed by Shakespeare into this new method for exploring deep character thoughts. But his influence extends beyond drama and into poetry, where the Romantic poets tried unsuccessfully to revive Shakespearean verse drama. It's been remarked that all English verse dramas, from Coleridge to Tennyson, are merely feeble variations on Shakespearean themes. At least that's what critic George Steiner has stated, and some are inclined to agree with him. John Milton, a pivotal English poet post-Shakespeare, also praised him, saying in that beautiful old language, "Thou in our wonder and astonishment hast built thyself a lifelong monument." His impact is also evident in the works of novelists like Thomas Hardy, William Faulkner, and the great Charles Dickens. Herman Melville's soliloquies in Moby Dick are heavily influenced by Shakespeare, with Captain Ahab echoing the tragic heroism of King Lear. Over 20,000 musical compositions have been inspired by Shakespeare, including Felix Mendelssohn's Overture for A Midsummer Night's Dream and Prokofiev's Romeo and Juliet's ballet. And it's not just that. He's got his fair share of opera inspiration. Giuseppe Verdi's Macbeth, Othello, and Falstaff stand in high critical regard on their own, comparable to their Shakespearean sources. Well, visual arts, too, have drawn from Shakespeare, with romantics and pre-Raphaelites finding inspiration in his plays. William Hogarth's 1745 portrayal of David Garrick as Richard III established the genre of theatrical portraiture in Britain, and even Sigmund Freud, the psychoanalyst who, in my opinion, thinks too much, that is possible, used Shakespearean characters, particularly from Hamlet, to frame his theories of human psychology. Well, to a more modern arena of expression, in film, Shakespeare's narratives have also been widely adapted, in ways that you might not think as well. Are you aware of Akira Kurosawa, the Japanese director? Well, his Throne of Blood and Ran reimagined Macbeth and King Lear, respectively. Max Reinhardt's A Midsummer Night's Dream, Laurence Olivier's Hamlet, and even Al Pacino's Looking for Richard show the range of Shakespeare's influence. Orson Welles' works, especially his portrayal of Falstaff in Chimes at Midnight, are also celebrated for their Shakespearean adaptations. Shakespeare's language also played a significant role in shaping modern English. In fact, Samuel Johnson, in his pioneering of a dictionary of the English language, relied quite heavily on Shakespeare. Phrases like "with bated breath" from The Merchant of Venice and "a foregone conclusion" are now commonplace in English. In fact, because it is so fun, I'm just going to read through a few, not all of course, but a few of the little phrases we have in the English language that are from Shakespeare. You might be surprised. All that glitters isn't gold. Be all and end all. It's all Greek to me. More sinned against than sinning. A method in the madness. Too much of a good thing. The lady doth protest too much. Foregone conclusion. Hot-blooded. Flaming youth. Each dog will have his day. Clothes make the man. And finally, witching time of the night. And perhaps you are listening in that witching time of the night where your eyes become heavier and you drift off to a good dream. Perhaps in your part of the world, and at the time you are listening, it will be midsummer. Well, drift off to that Midsummer Night's Dream then, in keeping with our theme for the video. Well, I would like to thank my top-tier patrons, being Stark Factory, JC, Jeffrey, and Charles. Thank you very much for everyone who support the channel, and thank you for watching the video. It sure has been enlightening. Go and read some Shakespeare. I think you owe it to yourself. Part of our great literary tradition. I assume that many of you are of the stock of European descent. Let's celebrate our culture and be proud of it. There's a lot to be proud of. Good night, everyone. See you tomorrow.